Lord, lift from us this mantle of exhaustion and fatigue. Lift from us the weariness of our souls and spare us from what seems like a daily assault of news that just confronts all the things we think are right. Lord, give us good news. Fortify our souls with the hope, the love, the grace, and the good news in Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Paragraph 112. Oh, by the way, Mike Lynch will definitely be joining us this evening.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So, nor can we fail to mention that seeking and pursuing the good of others and of the entire human family also implies helping individuals and societies to mature in the moral values that foster integral human development. The New Testament describes one fruit of the Holy Spirit, see Galatians 5:22, as agathosine. The Greek word expresses attachment to the good, pursuit of the good. Even more, it suggests a striving for excellence and what is best for others, their growth in maturity and health, the cultivation of values and not simply material well-being. A similar expression exists in Latin, benevolentia. It's an attitude that wills the good of others. It bespeaks a yearning for goodness, an inclination toward all that is fine and excellent, a desire to fill the lives of others with what is beautiful, sublime, and edifying. Helping individuals and societies to mature in the moral values that foster integral human development. Agathosine, the Greek word, expresses attachment to the good, pursuit of the good for ourselves and for the whole human family. That's a fruit of the Spirit.
I find that to be almost like an action item, being an attitude that wills the good of others. It really speaks to me to say that I have a responsibility to find the good, which is different than just being kind.
Yeah, I like it that he expresses this both as an attitude that wills the good of others, but also as a fruit of the Spirit. It's one of those reminders that Jesus, tells us the tree is known by its fruits. I don't know about you all, but I could spend a whole lot of time thinking about just that paragraph, but we've got other paragraphs to consider, so I guess we'll move on. Who would like to read?
Could I just make one comment on
Sure.
chapter 12, on 112? What strikes me about that is that it's just not a feeling, but it's also, he's describing this as a verb, as action. It's not simply I don't know how to describe it exactly, perceiving or being perceptive of what other people need. But it's a verb. It's a call to action in the ways that we are capable of acting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it says here, it bespeaks a yearning for goodness and inclination towards all that is fine and excellent, a desire to fill the lives of others with what is beautiful, sublime, and edifying.
Yeah.
But you need to take it to the next step, which is to do something to make that happen. And then in that way, that's how I would regard it as a verb in action.
I'm reminded that there was a neighborhood coalition group that was meeting in a large old Episcopal church in a neighborhood that had become kind of run down. And they were talking about programs, things they could do to enrich the neighborhood and turn things around in the neighborhood for the people that lived there, social programs that would help the people who lived there. And one of the people in that group was looking around at the rich tapestries in the church and the artwork that was in the church and the gold work, all of those things, and said, if this church was serious about really helping the neighborhood, they would sell all of this stuff and use the money to help the people in the neighborhood. And one of the people who was from that neighborhood spoke up at that point and said, "Oh, please don't do that. This is the only place in this neighborhood where we can come in and sit down and see beauty."
Wow,
Yeah.
that's heavy.
And, it's like, it depends on where you're standing and what you're looking for. But to fill the lives of others with all that is fine and excellent, with what is beautiful and sublime and edifying, there is something about that, with opening the eyes of others to art, to beauty, to grace, to letting people see the larger world, and to aspire to live in a world that is more full of grace and beauty and creativity. Anyway, that's just kind of where my mind went with all of that.
That reminds me of a trip to Prague and Czech Republic I did several years ago. And we went to the Basilica of Melk, M-E-L-K, in the border of all those small countries. And we went to a church service, and this is a huge, big open room. And a lot of the side panels had a statuary, one of which was completely covered in gold leaf. And I looked at that and I thought, my goodness, that would feed a third world country for years. But I didn't think of it from the perspective of what you just said. And that's very different from what I was thinking. Thank you for telling that reading. That was good.
Yeah, it's always worth thinking about. Is there another way to see this?
Yeah, that was marvelous. I like that. Thank you.
Who would like to read?
I can read.
I'll read. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Nani.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me okay? I don't know how my mic is on there.
Yes, you're fine.
Okay. Right. Here, regrettably, I feel bound to reiterate that we have had enough of immorality and the mockery of ethics, goodness, faith, and honesty. It is time to acknowledge that lighthearted superficiality has done us no good. Once the foundations of social life are corroded, What ensues are battles over conflicting interests. Let us return to promoting the good for ourselves and for the whole human family, and thus advance together towards an authentic and integral growth. Every society needs to ensure that values are passed on. Otherwise, what is handed down are selfishness, violence, corruption in its various forms, indifference, and ultimately a life closed to transcendence and entrenched in individual interests.
Hmm.
The value of solidarity. I would like especially to mention solidarity, which, as a moral virtue and social attitude born of personal conversion, calls for commitment on the part of those responsible for education and formation. I think first of families called to a primary and vital mission of education. Families are the first place where the values of love and fraternity, togetherness and sharing, concern and care for others are lived out and handed on. They are also the privileged milieu for transmitting the faith, beginning with those first simple gestures of devotion which mothers teach their children. Teachers, who have the challenging task of training children and youth in schools or other settings, should be conscious that their responsibility extends also to the moral, spiritual, and social aspects of life. The values of freedom, mutual respect, and solidarity can be handed on from a tender age. Communicators also have a responsibility for education and formation, especially nowadays when the means of information and communication are so widespread.
Okay, anybody want to say anything about that?
I'm struck by the use of the word solidarity, and that most of the time when I see the word, when I hear somebody talking about solidarity, they're talking about a group. And this is talking about solidarity in like a universal sense, as I see it.
Yeah. I still, when I hear the word solidarity, my mind goes back to Lech Walesa.
That's what I,
Very
And
good.
yeah, the Polish dock workers, and yeah. But I'm of that age.
As are many of us.
Did you say dottage or that age?
well done, Bob.
Moving on.
At a time when everything seems to disintegrate and lose consistency, it is good for us to appeal to the solidity born of the consciousness that we are responsible for the fragility of others as we strive to build a common future. Solidarity finds concrete expression in service, which can take a variety of forms in an effort to care for others. And service in great part means caring for vulnerability, for the vulnerable members of our families, our society, our people. In offering such service, individuals learn to set aside their own wishes and desires, their pursuit of power, before the concrete gaze of those who are most vulnerable. Service always looks to their faces, touches their flesh, senses their closeness, and even in some cases suffers that closeness and tries to help them. Service is never ideological, for we do not serve ideas, we serve people.
Yeah. That is a hard idea to get across to some people. Service is not ideological. We do not serve ideas, we serve people. Yeah. especially when you're having discussions with people about making changes in the way we do church. I'm thinking of the long road and the long discussions that we've had over the years about the role of gay and lesbian people in the church. Because it has, for a large part, been for many people an ideological issue. While for many of us, it's been an issue about people. On the one hand, people have been arguing on the basis of the idea of what the biblical texts say. On the other side, a lot of us have been arguing based on the experience of people who are feeling excluded because of a wall built of an interpretation of biblical texts. And of course, we've had to wage the discussion on both fronts. It's not, and that's not to say that the ideology isn't important. I mean, you have to draw lines. You have to stand somewhere. But for me, at least, I would always err on the side of grace. I would, I just always would. Anyway, but there's an example that comes to mind.
The needy generally practice the special solidarity that exists among those who are poor and suffering, and which our civilization seems to have forgotten or would prefer, in fact, to forget. Solidarity is a word that is not always well received. In certain situations, it has become a dirty word, a word that dare not be said. Solidarity means much more than engaging in sporadic acts of generosity. It means thinking and acting in terms of community. It means that the lives of all are prior to the appropriation of goods by a few. It also means combating the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work, land, and housing, the denial of social and labor rights. It means confronting the destructive effects of the empire of money. Solidarity, understood in its most profound meaning, is a way of making history, and this is what popular movements are doing.
Let me pause there. Is anybody else thinking about the things we learned on Sunday morning from the Gospel of Mark, from Binding the Strong Man, about the different economies at work in first century Palestine? And how there was just no conversation between those economies? You know, when I read that paragraph, that was the first thing that came to mind for me. There was the economy of the poor and the economy of the rich. And the two didn't have a lot to do with each other. Any other thoughts on that paragraph?
When we speak of the need to care for our common home, our planet, we appeal to that spark of universal consciousness and mutual concern that may still be present in people's hearts. Those who enjoy a surplus of water, yet choose to conserve it for the sake of the greater human family, have attained a moral stature that allows them to look beyond themselves and the group to which they belong. How marvelously human. The same attitude is demanded if we are to recognize the rights of all people, even those born beyond our own borders. Re-envisaging the social role of property. The world exists for everyone because all of us were born with the same dignity. Differences of color, religion, talent, place of birth or residence, and so many others cannot be used to justify the privileges of some over the rights of all. As a community, we have an obligation to ensure that every person lives with dignity and has sufficient opportunities for his or her integral development. In the first Christian centuries, a number of thinkers developed a universal vision in their reflections on the common destination of created goods. This led them to realize that if one person lacks what is necessary to live with dignity, it is because another person is detaining it. St. John Chrysostom summarizes it this way: "Not to share our wealth with the poor is to rob them and take away their livelihood. The riches we possess are not our own, but theirs as well." In the words of St. Gregory the Great, when we provide the needy with their basic needs, we are giving them what belongs to them, not to us.
Communists.
Yeah, exactly. Mhm.
That's what I thought when I read 116. It's very communistic with a small c.
Well, the fact of the matter is that Christianity is that way.
True, true.
And this is why it's always baffled me a little bit that Christians get their shorts in a knot about socialism,
True.
because we are called to share what we have. We are called to look out for each other. We're called to care for each other. And so what's the problem?
It's a great mystery.
I kind of feel like all kind of economic systems require some sort of sharing. It's just a question of how much.
Right.
Good. I like that.
And so I mean, I don't find this so communistic because he's talking about basic needs. And actually I was focusing on you know, basic needs in the United States is very different than basic needs in Africa.
Right. So then the discussion becomes, when you start talking about, for example, universal health care, is that a basic need? Well, I would say it is, but then there are people who would argue with that and say it isn't.
You betcha. You betcha.
And then off we go.
And so and actually, you know, that's interesting because the discussion is, I mean, what is being pointed out is the discussion should be done in solidarity.
For what was you said? I'm sorry.
If the discussion of whether or not universal health care is a basic need, that discussion should be held in a spirit of solidarity.
Well, it is. And the best discussions I've had with people on that are about the ways that universal health care makes the whole country stronger.
Right. Like education.
Right. It works for all of us. Because we are all in this together. Anyway.
But we're also being challenged by this reading that we should be thinking outside of ourselves. So even if it is not our own personal need, If it's your personal need, I should care about it. I should be wanting that for you, right?
Mhm.
Like that's
Right.
kind of what he's talking about, or at least what I understand about it, which
Yeah.
I understand there will never be enough funds or money for everything, but we should be trying to ensure that all of those basic needs for everybody are being taken care of, even if they're not our own personal basic needs, but our the basic needs of other people.
Right.
Mhm.
And just to bring this back to its appropriate frame, he's talking to people who claim to be followers of Jesus. Well, I mean, he's talking to everybody. But for those of us who do claim to be followers of Jesus, these things are the basic minimum. I mean, this is the model that Jesus set and that St. Paul elaborated on. This isn't new. And he's reminding us of this.
Right.
So it's just that we've gotten so used to arguing in the public square, I guess, that we forget that if we're having an internal conversation among us as believers, this is a refresher course. And it really is, in many ways, the good news that we have to preach. Hey, folks, this is the world we're talking about. This is the world that really is good news for all of us, where we all live with more equity, where we all live in solidarity, where we all care about each other. And here's what it looks like.
So one thing that idea I've been thinking about with regards to our economy is how much emphasis there is on consumerism and profit. And so the ethic in our economy, in our country, seems to be that if you work hard and do well and you know, if you apply yourself, then you're going to get your reward. Which means that if you don't work hard, if it infers that you don't work hard because you haven't achieved something, our philosophy and our economy seems to say, well, if you haven't achieved anything, you really don't deserve it. And it comes down to, well, what do you deserve? And then you have big corporations that are providing benefits for people with their charitable giving. But I always ask myself, is it on the basis of a Christian value? Is it a basis of a faith? Is it faith-based, or is it simply to promote their brand?
Or for tax benefit.
Well, okay, that's true. That's a good point, and maybe that I haven't thought about it in that way, but I think that even drives that point home further.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's beginning to bother. Our basic economic system is really beginning to trouble me because of the emphasis on profit and the emphasis on well, if you're benefited by your work, but if you have a need, I'm not describing this, I'm not explaining myself very well, but if you have a need, so many people think that maybe you don't deserve it. Why should you get this or that if you can't work economically? And I think what really has set this off for me and made me think about it more is an interview I saw last week regarding the senator from Maine, who is an independent. His last name is King. And he was saying that in Maine, in the rural areas of Maine, things have gotten very difficult. And he pointed out that there was a paper mill in Maine that used to hire 5,000 people. And it gave that community a lot of economic benefits, supported the community, lifted the community up. And then the paper mill went away. It probably went overseas someplace where it could be done cheaper. And I think this also goes back to health. Doesn't everybody in our country deserve to be treated and deserve to have supported by a health program? Why is it that, and I don't call it universal health, I just say health should be available to everyone because we have the economic capabilities of providing it. You know, I hear things on the news about how many billions of dollars are spent on this, that, and the other for, you know, what I consider to be trivial things based on
Or on campaigns.
And so it's very troubling to me that in our effort to what we consider to think is bolstering our economy, we're pushing a lot of these basic manufacturing businesses offshore. And manufacturing is it really concerns me also because I think it's not in our long-term benefit to have our manufacturing done elsewhere because then it moves our economy. It doesn't enable people who don't fit either a service economy or a tech economy. Where do they fit? You know, and maybe I'm being simplistic about this, but I think about after World War II when your manufacturing was at its height, and we were doing so well in terms of our economy. And that was because I think people had a lot of different places where they could take their skills and fit into the economy. There were a lot of different niches where people could find a place to do what they felt best to do. So I feel comfortable with my work, which is technical writing, but my God, I would never be able to work in a building cars or doing anything. As you all know, I'm not even allowed to have tools or discouraged from having tools. And so it troubles me greatly that our economy is not really set up to support people that are in need.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, Phil, it troubles me greatly that so much of the measure of our economy right now is entirely on paper, entirely based on the metric of the stock market. So it's all an investment return. And since the deregulation that allowed financial institutions to reinvest in themselves and invest in other stocks, there's been a cycle of money where that money keeps, that those stocks keep getting inflated in value. It just seems to me like a bubble that's getting larger and larger and larger. But that's a discussion for another day. But that's still viewed as one of the primary metrics of our economy, which it's just weird. I mean, you look at what's happened during the pandemic, manufacturing has been way down, joblessness has been way up, but the stock market, after an initial crash, recovered and has been more or less soaring. It's like that makes no sense at all, except that people with money are putting it someplace, and that is a place where, because of the game that's being played with stocks being bought and the Federal Reserve continuing to fund it all, it just, that value keeps getting inflated. So it looks like it's making money. It just,
Well, it's
But
recirculating.
I
The
can't
ultra
resist.
wealthy are recirculating the wealth amongst themselves, you know, so it's kind of like it goes up like this, but it's all up here, you know, and the huge majority of the population of this country who own no stocks at all are just completely used, basically.
what were you going to say, Bob?
Couple of aspects about that is that one is that Vanguard is a big stock or mutual fund creator, and they did a presentation yesterday in which their CEO and their chief investment officer was saying, and a funny story, but anyway, was saying that they anticipate that the return on bonds will be between 1 and 2% for the next decade. And the return on equity will be somewhere between 5 and 7% for the next decade. So, and that's because of exactly what you were pointing out, is that the valuations on these things have become so inflated that the price earning ratios are huge. And the funny thing I wanted to mention is that the CEO, in recapping the investment officer, said, "You've just heard that the interest on bonds could be 2% over the next decade." The investment officer jumped back in and said 1 to 2%.
Oh,
And so anyway, that's the first thing that comes to mind that in terms of what's been going on in the economy. But the other thing is that I really do think that over the last election cycle is that the Democrats have to me recognized, and I could be argued with, but will have recognized their mistake in letting manufacturing deteriorate so badly. And I think we're actually going to see some focus, if you will, on the so-called forgotten man.
well, yeah. Trying to remember where it was that I saw it, but I saw a study not too long ago that said if we would put real focus on just infrastructure in this country, it would be a huge boost in the arm for the economy. And it would be real dollars.
People, yeah.
And that would also create new manufacturing jobs and revitalize our domestic steel industry and just do all kinds of ancillary things in the process. Anyway, where were we?
I believe we're starting.
120, you want me to go on? Okay. Once more, I would like to echo a statement of St. John Paul II, whose forcefulness has perhaps been insufficiently recognized. God gave the earth to the whole human race for the sustenance of all its members, without excluding or favoring anyone. For my part, I would observe that the Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute or inviolable, and has stressed the social purpose of all forms of private property. The principle of the common use of created goods is the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. It is a natural and inherent right that takes priority over others. All other rights having to do with the goods necessary for the integral fulfillment of persons, including that of private property or any other type of property, should, in the words of St. Paul VI, in no way hinder this right, but should actively facilitate its implementation. The right to private property can only be considered a secondary natural right, derived from the principle of the universal destination of created goods. This has concrete consequences that ought to be reflected in the workings of society. Yet it often happens that secondary rights displace primary and overriding rights, in practice making them irrelevant.
Oh, that almost sounds like a paragraph from a contract. Um,
Yeah.
Wow. Anybody want to unpack that?
You know, I have to say my first reaction to that is that he's got it backwards, and that you know, if you look at natural law, is that might makes right, and I'm you know I'm sad to say that, but to me the whole effort of the church is to change that, and is to make that, cause that to be more equitable. So I have a little trouble with seeing you know the idea of private of property held in common, I guess. And while I want to see it used for that, you know, to say that that's the kind of the first law, I have some difficulty with that.
I have a
I was
little
raised
trouble.
Republican,
It
so.
seems the hypocrisy in that is a little scary for me, because and if what I'm interpreting it correctly, coming from the Catholic Church, it seems very odd to me, because isn't there, we talked about that a little bit earlier, there's a huge amassment of private property belonging to the Catholic Church, in that sense private. And I don't know if he's saying that that makes it communal, since it's a whole. Does he mean just individual? Is that what he means by private? I don't know.
Yeah, he's not here for us to ask him. The Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute or inviolable. Well, frankly, neither has the United States government.
No.
There's the right of eminent domain and all of that to deal with. The principle of the common use of created goods is the first principle of the whole ethical and social order.
I think maybe when we look at it originally or initially, we think of property as being land. When I look at it a little bit more, I think, well, private property, what is private property? This laptop that I'm using is quote unquote private property. But when I'm gone, it's no longer mine. So why should I consider it my property and think it's reserved only for me? And in essence, I'm holding it, I'm kind of renting it for life. I have a, what's that? I have a life, a tenancy.
Life estate.
Yeah, I have a life estate in my laptop. I have a life estate basically in our house. So private property is not going to continue after I pass along. It's going to belong to other people.
Well, yeah, there's that. I think about the Jubilee laws in
Yeah.
in the Pentateuch. Every 50 years, there's supposed to be a year of Jubilee, and all property reverts back to its original owners. As far as we know, Jubilee was never actually practiced. But in part, specifically because of that reason, that nobody wanted to try to enforce giving back the land that people were holding. I don't know. That's just such a challenging paragraph.
It is.
I agree.
It is.
I have trouble with it. Well, I mean, it seems like it's not making any distinction between the attitude of the preservation and provision for each individual's human dignity. And like you were talking about before, giving the equal opportunities to people to be able to achieve, like when I think it was Phil was talking about how if you don't work, if you don't make it because you, and it means you're not working hard enough. I mean, the concept that because people benefit very, you know, disparate differences between the benefit obtained from the work that's done, that is not anywhere near equal. So, I mean, I understand those concepts, and I understand the idea that you know, we are to, like Phil was just saying, we're to always have a conscious awareness of the fact that things that we have are because of the grace of God, and it's not any, you know, we're to be liberal in our sharing and the administration of the gifts that are given to us. I understand that concept, but I'm having trouble with the idea that it's wrong to have ownership of anything, even if it's just, you know, for our time here on earth. I don't know.
I don't think he's saying it's wrong. I just think he's saying, well, you don't have an inviolable right to it.
Right.
That whatever rights you have are secondary. And that I think what he's trying to say is that whatever rights get asserted by law should be secondary. But we've got it backwards.
Like you say, is that like eminent domain? Is that what he's saying? I mean, the concept that for the good of many, we should subvert our individual right. Is that what you mean? Or, I don't know.
Honestly, I'd really like to hear him unpack this and answer our questions. Because it's confusing. And
You should have an email contact there that you can say, send
Yeah.
questions.
But I mean, I can see the church saying, you know, that God gave the earth, the sentence about God gave the earth to the whole human race for the sustenance of all its
Right.
members. And, and, you know, and that with you know, with Ellen's comment about human dignity, you know, and how we should treat it or how we should look at it. It's just that when we start talking about, you know, doing away, you know, absolving private property, that everybody goes crazy.
I can see it. I can see an example here, though, where let's say you own a big piece of property and you discover that there's a big giant pool of oil underneath it, but you live in it, but that property is in an area where if you wanted to tap into that oil, it would cause all kinds of ecological damage that would affect the area on a wide scale and ruin the water sources of your neighbors and things like that. I think what he's saying there is you don't have an inviolable right just because it's under your property to go after that oil. You don't have an inviolable right to dig in and you know, go after you know, create a gold mine on your property just because it's on your property, if doing so is going to wreck the habitats and destroy the environment around you and all of that. I'm wondering if that's kind of where he's going with that. That you have to consider all the ethical considerations surrounding it. You know, as I kind of reread through it, I'm thinking that might be another way to come out what he's saying here. But yeah, but we read it in terms of ownership, don't we? Like, does that mean someone else can come and put a house on my land? I mean,
Right.
or because someone can
If
come
they
and
need
say,
to.
I want this house.
Right. That's where it gets complicated. Yeah.
So if we read further, it might answer some of our questions too.
Perhaps.
Okay.
The
Sorry.
rights of peoples and the rights without borders.
Okay. Want me to go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. Rights without borders. No one then can remain excluded because of his or her place of birth, much less because of privileges enjoyed by others who were born in lands of greater opportunity. The limits and borders of individual states cannot stand in the way of this. As it is unacceptable that some have fewer rights by virtue of being women, it is likewise unacceptable that the mere place of one's birth or residence should result in his or her possessing fewer opportunities for a developed and dignified life.
Oh.
Development must not aim at the amassing of wealth by a few, but must ensure human rights, personal and social, economic and political, including the rights of nations and of peoples. The right of some to free enterprise or market freedom cannot supersede the rights of peoples and the dignity of the poor, or for that matter, respect for the natural environment. For if we make something our own, it is only to administer it for the good of all. Business activity is essentially a noble vocation directed to producing wealth and improving our world. God encourages us to develop the talents he gave us, and he has made our universe one of immense potential. In God's plan, each individual is caused to promote his or her own development, and this includes finding the best economic and technological means of multiplying goods and increasing wealth. Business abilities, which are a gift from God, should always be clearly directed to the development of others and to eliminating poverty, especially through the creation of diversified work opportunities. The right to private property is always accompanied by the primary and prior principle of the subordination of all private property to the universal destination of the earth's goods, and thus the right of all to their use.
Let's stop there for a minute. In fact, maybe let's just stop there.
The one thing that came to mind before when we were talking about that, a distinction would be the fact that all of the industries that have moved overseas, and that I don't think it's nationalism to say it's wrong to take the jobs elsewhere that our own people in our own country need. It's what's wrong about it to me is if it is done not to benefit the people to whom the jobs are being taken, but rather to take advantage of them and profit off of it.
Yeah, and it's also done to enrich shareholders at the expense of workers.
Right.
And that's
Yeah,
a matter of workers being treated as items on a balance sheet rather than as people.
Right. We talked about that.
So that's, treating people as a commodity and not as human beings. That's part of what makes it objectionable. Business abilities. Wait, sorry, Bob, can you just hang on there for a second? Business abilities, which are a gift from God, should always be clearly directed to the development of others and to eliminating poverty, especially through the creation of diversified work opportunities. What would happen if you read that at a shareholders meeting?
Yeah. It's almost like the reverse of capitalism because it precludes profit as a motivation ever. And it usually is in business, at least in this country.
I read that and I immediately thought of Don Mullane.
Yeah.
because that is what he lived by in building a company and the good that he did for others.
Yeah, he was more interested in making sure his people were well taken care of than in his bottom line.
That's right.
Right.
John would often share with us that he, as a CEO and owner of the company, was paid less than his salespeople.
Yep.
That's amazing.
He really, he lived that. He really lived that. And he always said that his business was a gift from God and he never took it for granted.
Yeah.
And
It was a
when you
means
mentioned
of
about,
dispersing for him. Yeah.
and when you mentioned about being read at a shareholders meeting, kind of an interesting aspect of this is that about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, is that the concept developed of a corporation that would be interested in social issues as well as profit. And they actually, across the United States, have created, states have created something called social corporations. Because the concern being that if you're a director of a for-profit corporation, your primary interest is the shareholder and shareholder value. And so if you were going to have a social benefit as well, you would be violating your fiduciary duty as a director of that corporation. So they actually created a different form of corporation that could have a social interest as well as a profit interest.
Just how American is it that we had to create a separate category for that?
And I should tell you that the
Because it's
for-profit
the opposite of capitalism, as known.
that the for-profit world that I came from was, I wouldn't say up in arms, but looked askance at the idea that you could divide it, you could divide the two,
Right.
or incorporate the two into one.
Well, it's not unlike the Angels baseball organization. They have the Angels baseball, and then you have the community outreach philanthropic that is a whole nother, it's kind of the Angels, but they have a whole separate division and group of people managing the philanthropic part of it, which only benefits the overall umbrella of the Angels. And it's not unlike other company. Wells Fargo has it. Back Home Savings, they had way back. They all had these groups that reported to the board, but they were a separate nonprofit entity of those organizations.
In my retirement fund with the ELCA, we have the choice of where our retirement funds go in terms of different funds. We have the diversified fund, and then we have the social responsibility fund. And you know, there are options within those as well, but it's always struck me as interesting that it's like there's that very clear choice. You know, it's also fascinating to me that the returns are about the same.
That is fascinating. Yeah.
Anyway, this has been great. I will see you all this evening.